It was the first snowfall of the year when Carla walked into the adoption agency for what felt like the 100th time. She had prepared herself for disappointment again, but something deep inside urged her to hold on. Maybe today would be different. The quiet hum of the radiator filled the air as she sat down in the musty office, clasping her hands tightly on her lap. Across from her, the caseworker flipped through a thin folder. "There is one boy," she finally said, her voice hesitant. "He's been through several placements. No one's quite been able to handle him." Carla straightened in her chair, her heart pounding. "What's his name?" "Eli," the woman replied, pushing the folder toward her. The boy staring back from the photo had a face full of anger, his dark eyes hard and untrusting. But Carla saw something else behind that gaze, something wounded but still hopeful. It stirred a deep sympathy in her, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. "I'll meet him," she said softly, ignoring the concerned look the caseworker gave her. And that was how Eli entered her life. But Carla had no idea what awaited her. This wasn't the story of a perfect adoption where love conquers all. It was a long, painful struggle filled with heartbreak and the gnawing question of whether she had made the wrong choice. The first few months with Eli were worse than she could have ever imagined. The boy barely spoke, and when he did, it was filled with anger. He lashed out, breaking things, refusing to follow even the simplest of rules. At school, he got into fights. At home, he spent hours alone, locking himself in his room. Carla tried everything: therapy, discipline, patience, but nothing worked. Eli had walls built so high, she wondered if they'd ever come down. The neighbors started to notice. "Maybe he's just too much for you, Carla," one said after Eli had smashed a window during one of his fits. Carla didn't answer. She wasn't ready to admit defeat. She had promised herself that she wouldn't abandon him like everyone else had. But the question gnawed at her constantly. What if love wasn't enough? One evening, Carla received the news that would change her life forever. She was at the kitchen table, paying bills, when her phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was calm, but the words cut through her like a knife. "Carla, we've found something in your tests. We need you to come in right away." Her world tilted, and suddenly, everything she had been fighting for, the normalcy she had tried to create with Eli, seemed to slip out of reach. She was about to face something far more terrifying than raising a troubled child. Carla sat in the doctor's office the next morning, her stomach in knots. The sterile smell of disinfectant and the hum of medical equipment made her dizzy with dread. The doctor entered, holding a clipboard and wearing a grave expression. She barely heard the words he said. Stage 2 cancer, aggressive treatment, surgery, chemotherapy. Each word felt like a blow. She had no family, no close friends, just Eli, and he was barely talking to her. Driving home, Carla gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not with Eli still so broken. But the reality of her situation crushed her like a weight she couldn't bear. That night, as she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her face pale and drawn, she decided she wouldn't tell Eli. At least not yet. He had enough anger in him already. What would happen if he knew she was sick? No, for now, she would hold this burden alone. She turned off the light and went to bed, but sleep didn't come. The next morning, Carla prepared Eli's breakfast, the same routine she had been keeping up for nearly 2 years now. He stomped into the kitchen, his backpack slung carelessly over his shoulder. He didn't even look at her as he grabbed a piece of toast and mumbled something about being late. She opened her mouth to ask him to sit down, to eat something real for once, but she stopped herself. What was the point? She watched him walk out the door, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. The boy was a storm and she was a woman running out of time. Weeks passed, and Carla began her treatment. She kept it secret from Eli, sneaking off to doctor's appointments while he was at school and hiding her growing fatigue under layers of makeup. But the chemo was harsh. It drained her of energy, leaving her pale and weak. One evening, as she was folding laundry, her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, the world spinning around her. Her phone was in the other room, too far to reach. Just then, the door opened, and Eli walked in. He stopped when he saw her on the ground, his eyes widening in shock. "What happened?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. Carla tried to brush it off, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired, that's all." But Eli wasn't buying it. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. He stood there, staring at her, fists clenched at his sides. "You're sick, aren't you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Carla couldn't hold it in any longer. The lie was too heavy. "Yes, Eli," she whispered. "I'm sick, but I didn't want to burden you. I didn't know how you'd react." Eli's face twisted in anger. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me? After everything?" He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Carla's heart sank. She had feared this exact reaction, and now it was happening. She lay on the floor, helpless and alone. For the next few days, Eli barely spoke to her. He stayed out late, avoided her at every turn, and when they crossed paths, his anger simmered just beneath the surface. Carla tried to reach out, but he refused to let her in. The distance between them, which she had fought so hard to close, grew wider by the day. But something changed the night Eli came home after midnight, reeking of cigarettes and anger. Carla had been waiting for him, sitting on the couch, her body weak from another round of chemo. When he stumbled into the living room, his eyes met hers for the first time in days. "Sit down," she said, her voice soft but firm. Eli hesitated, but then, to her surprise, he dropped onto the couch beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with things neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Eli broke the tension. "I'm scared," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Carla looked at him, shocked by the vulnerability in his voice. He had never said anything like that before. "I'm scared too," she admitted, "but we're going to get through this, together." Eli's eyes filled with tears, though he quickly wiped them away. For the first time, Carla saw the boy he used to be, the one who had been hurt so many times that he built walls so no one could ever hurt him again. Slowly, carefully, he began to let those walls down. The next day, Eli came home from school and found Carla resting on the couch, her skin pale and her hair thinning. Without a word, he grabbed the remote control and sat next to her. They watched TV in silence, but something had shifted. He was there with her, really there. Days turned into weeks, and while Carla's illness worsened, Eli started to change. He took on more responsibility. He started cooking dinner, doing the laundry, and even driving Carla to her appointments when she was too weak to go alone. It wasn't easy for him. There were still moments when he lashed out, when the weight of everything became too much. But slowly, the anger was replaced by something deeper. One afternoon, Carla sat Eli down. "I need to tell you something," she began. "I don't know how much time I have left, but I want you to know that no matter what happens, I love you. I've always loved you." Eli stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked out of the room. Carla felt the familiar pang of disappointment. Maybe she had said too much, or maybe he wasn't ready to hear it. But just as she was about to get up, Eli returned. In his hands was a small, worn-out photograph, the one Carla had kept of him from the adoption agency. "I found this in your room," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You kept it all this time?" Carla nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "From the moment I saw that picture, I knew you were meant to be my son." Eli's face crumbled. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to cry in front of her. And as he did, Carla pulled him into her arms, holding him close as the walls between them finally crumbled for good. The chemotherapy was taking its toll, and Carla had grown so weak that she could barely move without assistance. Her once vibrant skin had turned an ashen gray, and her hair had thinned so much that Eli could see her scalp. She spent most of her days in bed now, too exhausted to do much of anything. But in those moments of stillness, she found comfort in Eli's presence. He hadn't said it out loud, but Carla knew he was finally starting to trust her. Eli, now nearly 18, had taken on the role of caretaker, a burden far too heavy for someone so young. But every day, he rose to the challenge. He cooked her meals, handled the household chores, and even took on a part-time job to help pay the medical bills that kept piling up. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the weight of it all made him shut down, when he disappeared for hours just to escape the suffocating reality. But every time, he came back. And that, more than anything, gave Carla hope. It was a crisp fall afternoon when the first major turning point came. Carla had woken up feeling weaker than ever. Her breaths were shallow and her chest ached with every inhale. Eli was at work and the house was eerily quiet. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, and dialed Eli's number. No answer. Her vision blurred, and the room around her spun. Panic set in. What if she couldn't hold on? What if this was it? With her last bit of strength, she pressed the emergency button on her phone. Eli was stocking shelves at the grocery store when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another text from one of his friends. But when he saw the flashing emergency alert, his blood ran cold. It was his mom. Without thinking, Eli dropped everything and bolted for the door. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled to start his car, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the keys. The drive home felt like an eternity. Every second stretched out, his mind racing with horrible possibilities. When he finally burst through the front door, he found Carla collapsed on the floor, barely conscious. "Mom," he yelled, rushing to her side. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her face pale and drawn. I tried to call you," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. "I'm here now," Eli choked out, tears streaming down his face. He scooped her up in his arms and gently carried her to the couch, grabbing his phone to call an ambulance. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely dial the number, but he managed to get through. As they waited for the ambulance, Eli held Carla's hand tightly, refusing to let go. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I need you." Carla smiled faintly, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and love. "I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." The hospital was a blur of lights and noise. Doctors and nurses rushed around Carla's bedside, hooking her up to machines, taking vitals, murmuring in medical jargon that Eli didn't understand. He stood helplessly in the corner, watching the scene unfold, his stomach twisted in knots. He had never been so scared in his life. Hours passed before a doctor finally approached him. "She's stable for now, but her condition is critical," the doctor said, his voice grim. "We're doing everything we can, but it's touch and go." Eli nodded numbly, his mind struggling to process the words. He had always known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. He was terrified of losing the one person who had fought so hard to love him, even when he hadn't deserved it. That night, Eli sat by Carla's bedside, refusing to leave her side. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, the soft beep of the machines keeping her alive. His thoughts raced, a storm of guilt and regret crashing through him. He hadn't always treated her well. He had pushed her away when she had done nothing but try to help him. And now, as he looked at her fragile form, he realized just how much she meant to him. 2 days later, Carla woke up, her eyelids fluttering open to the sight of Eli slumped in a chair beside her, fast asleep. His face was streaked with dried tears, and his clothes were rumpled from sleeping in them. She reached out weakly, her fingers brushing his arm. Eli jerked awake, his eyes wide with panic. But when he saw Carla's tired smile, relief flooded his face. "You're awake," he breathed, leaning forward to take her hand in his. Carla nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Eli quickly grabbed a cup of water and helped her drink, his movements careful and gentle, as if he were afraid she might break. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for pushing you away, for not being the son you deserved." Carla's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his voice. She squeezed his hand, her eyes locking onto his. "You've been more than I ever could have asked for," she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've saved me, Eli, in more ways than you know." Eli shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "No, you saved me. I don't know where I'd be without you." For a long moment they sat there, holding each other's gaze, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. And in that moment, something shifted. The anger, the resentment, the pain, it all melted away, leaving behind only love and gratitude. Eli realized with startling clarity that Carla had given him something he had never had before, a family. She had loved him when no one else would, and now it was his turn to love her back. But just as the quiet moment settled over them, the doctor returned with a heavy look on his face. "We need to talk," he said, glancing at both of them. Eli's stomach dropped, fear clawing at his insides. The doctor's words came slowly, deliberately. Carla's condition has worsened. We've done all we can, but it's time to start thinking about making her comfortable.
Hey there, quick message. Grab a paper, write down Herokind Stories, our channel name. Come back soon, we've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
The world seemed to stop. Eli felt like he had been punched in the gut. What does that mean? He asked, his voice barely audible. It means, the doctor said softly, that we're out of options. Eli stared at the doctor, his mind reeling. No, this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when they had finally found their way back to each other. He looked at Carla, her face peaceful despite the devastating news, and something inside him snapped. He wouldn't let this be the end. We're not giving up, Eli said, his voice shaking with determination. We'll find another way. Carla reached out and touched his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Eli, she said softly, her voice filled with love. It's okay. I've had everything I could ever want, because I had you. Tears welled in Eli's eyes, but he shook his head, refusing to accept it. No, Mom, I'm not losing you. And in that moment, Carla realized just how much Eli had changed. The boy she had adopted all those years ago, the angry, scared, broken child, was gone. In his place was a man who loved her fiercely, who was willing to fight for her, no matter what. The days that followed the doctor's devastating news were some of the hardest of Eli's life. The hospital room had become a second home, and though Carla's strength was fading, Eli refused to leave her side. Every breath she took seemed heavier than the last, but her spirit, despite the looming end, remained steady. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the room, Eli sat beside her, holding her hand. They hadn't spoken much that day. Carla's energy had been too low for conversation, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the understanding that time was slipping away. Eli, Carla whispered, her voice so soft that he had to lean in to hear her. Promise me something. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. Anything. Promise me you'll keep going, that you won't let this break you. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. You've come so far. Don't lose yourself now. Tears filled Eli's eyes, but he nodded. I promise. Carla smiled weakly, a look of peace settling over her face. I'm proud of you, she said, her voice filled with a love that ran deeper than words could ever express. More than you know. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room. Eli felt the weight of her words settle in his chest, like a final gift she was leaving behind for him to carry. He couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too large, the emotions too overwhelming. Instead, he squeezed her hand, hoping she could feel everything he wanted to say. That night, Carla slipped away quietly, her breathing slowing until finally it stopped. Eli sat by her side, tears streaming down his face, his heart heavy with grief. But as he looked at her peaceful expression, a strange sense of calm washed over him. She was no longer suffering. And though the pain of losing her cut deep, he knew, deep down, that Carla had given him everything he needed to survive without her. The funeral was small and intimate, just a few close friends and some of the neighbors who had known Carla. Eli stood at the front, looking out at the faces that had gathered to say goodbye. The grief was raw, and the hole Carla left in his life felt enormous. But standing there, Eli realized something important. He wasn't alone. Carla had built a network of people who cared about her, and now, by extension, cared about him. After the service, one of Carla's friends, an older woman named Martha, approached Eli. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. She loved you more than anything, you know that? Martha said, her voice gentle. You were her whole world. Eli nodded, trying to keep the tears at bay. I know, he whispered. She'd want you to keep moving forward, to live your life fully, Martha added. That's what she fought so hard for. In the weeks that followed, Eli tried to pick up the pieces of his life. The house felt empty without Carla's presence, but her memory lingered in every corner. He kept the small photograph of himself that Carla had held onto for so many years, placing it on the nightstand by his bed. It was a reminder of where he had come from, of how far he had grown. Eli returned to work and school, but something had shifted inside him. He was no longer the angry, troubled boy who had pushed everyone away. Carla's love had changed him, had given him a sense of belonging and purpose. And now, even though she was gone, he carried that love with him. One day, several months after the funeral, Eli received a letter in the mail. It was from Carla's lawyer, asking him to come in to discuss her estate. Confused, Eli made his way to the lawyer's office, where he was handed an envelope with Carla's handwriting on the front. Inside was a letter from Carla, written in the final weeks of her life. Eli, if you're reading this, then I've already said goodbye. I know you're hurting, and I wish more than anything that I could be there to hold your hand through it. But I need you to remember something important. You are stronger than you think. You've always been stronger than you think. I'm leaving the house to you. It's not much, but it's a place where you can start fresh, where you can build the life you deserve. Use it however you need to. And one last thing, don't ever doubt that I loved you with all my heart. You were my greatest joy, Eli, my son. With all my love, Carla. Eli stared at the letter, tears spilling down his cheeks. The house, the one place that had always felt like a battlefield, was now his. But more than that, Carla had given him the final push he needed to move forward, to live. With the house now his, Eli decided to stay. He enrolled in community college, determined to make something of himself, to honor the promise he had made to Carla. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life. He made friends, found a part-time job that he enjoyed, and started volunteering at a local youth center for kids who were struggling, just like he had been once. And every night, when he returned home, he'd look at the photograph of himself that Carla had saved all those years ago. It was a reminder of her love, of her belief in him, and it gave him the strength to keep going, even when things got tough. One evening, as Eli sat in the living room, flipping through the worn pages of a book Carla had loved, he smiled to himself. He missed her every day, but he knew she was still with him, in every decision he made, in every step he took toward the future. Carla had given him the greatest gift of all, the strength to live, and Eli intended to use it, one day at a time. If you were moved by this story, make sure to click the video appearing on your screen now. An unforgettable tale of love, sacrifice, and resilience is waiting for you. Don't miss it.